Class and status in Korean history. Social status system in ancient and medieval Korea.
So beginning with the ancient period, let's take a look at how social status was structured and how it became to be defined the way that it was in ancient and medieval Korea.
What is the bone rank system?
Going back to the Shilla dynasty, the Shilla society was structured by the bone rank system. And the bone rank system was a hereditary system. So your social status was defined by your birth. At the top of the social system were the hallowed bones. And these were the group of people who were qualified to be the royal family. You had to be born into this class to be a king or a queen. Next were the true bones, and the true bones were the aristocrats. They were the nobility, and they held the highest positions in the government. Again, in order to hold those positions, you had to be of true bone rank. The following rank were the sixth head rank, and the sixth head rank held about medium level positions in the government. The following were the fifth head rank and then the fourth head rank, and you can see that they go down in ranking. There is no mention of the third, second, and first ranks in the records that are extant today. However, we assume that they exist since we have this sixth, fifth, fourth head ranking. Now, depending on which rank you were born into, you could only go so far in terms of class, and there was no upward social mobility. If there was intermarriage in between the ranks, then the offspring would take the lower rank position. So there's very little motivation to intermarry, and so we see that there's very little evidence of intermarriage between the ranks, and that actually the marriages were confined to each other in their ranks. If we look at the aristocrats of this time, we see that they have landed estates and were often granted land by the king. Now, you may be asking, why was this the case? Why would the king give land to the aristocrats? Well, often this was to reward them or to try to placate them. So, for example, in the Shilla dynasty, once they unified the peninsula, they incorporated elements from other kingdoms, Baekje and Goguryeo. And so in order to mollify the aristocrats from those kingdoms, grants of land were given from the king. Commoners also held land, and land was, in fact, at the time, measured not by its size, but in terms of its productivity. So while one person may own a piece of land that is very large, if it is not very productive, it's not considered to be that valuable, as opposed to a smaller piece of land that is very productive, then that would be considered a valuable piece of land. Most commoners too, if they owned an oxen or if they owned a mulberry tree, this was a sign of wealth amongst the commoners. But during Shilla, as I mentioned, there was very little social mobility or movement between the classes other than downward social mobility. And one classic example that we have of this is Jang Bogo. So Jang Bogo lived from approximately 787 to 846. And he had gone to what was then the part of China, and he had seen that as a result of piracy in the region, that there had been many Koreans that had been kidnapped and trafficked as human slaves. And he saw this and found it to be very sad. So he was determined to end the slave trade of his peoples. And as a result, he ended up establishing his own base, having quite a large private retinue of soldiers, and acquired a great amount of wealth for himself because he was able to dominate the triangular maritime trade between Korea, China, and Japan. But despite his accumulation of wealth, his prominence, his popularity, this did not mean that he was able to rise in social rank. So at one point, he had tried to make a deal with the Shilla king and to marry the king's daughter, the princess, which would allow him to marry into the royal family, but in the end, he was assassinated and this attempt failed. So 장보고, even though he had great amount of wealth, he had great amounts of people who reported to him. He had many ships as a result of this maritime trade. He was recognized abroad in the Tang Dynasty and in Japan, but despite all of this, he still was only a merchant. Towards the end of the Shilla dynasty, the members of the hallowed bone rank begin to die out. The males begin to die out. And so then this leaves a question of who the kingship could go to. Now, at one point, since there were only females around, then the next ruling person became the queen. But after all of these died out, then the kingship went to the true bones. But those among the true bones, the aristocrats, how do you determine who becomes king? So there is conflict over the succession, and this leads to turmoil and infighting. So that by the end of the Shilla dynasty, what we see is the collapse of the bone rank system. And it is eventually destroyed by local strongmen. So while the hallowed bones had died out, and there were many true bones that were fighting amongst themselves for the kingship, in fact, there was a group of people who were quite dissatisfied with the whole bone rank system in general. And this was the sixth head rank group. This is because there were many talented people amongst the sixth head rank, but they could only rise to the mid-level in the government. And even though several people, scholars such as Choi Jae-woo, were able to go to the Tang Dynasty, be educated there, pass the civil service exam, even become officials in the Tang government, once they returned to Shilla, they were still confined to the rank that they were born into. So by the end of the Shilla dynasty, there are these local strongmen with their own private armies spread throughout the country, and they collaborate with many of these sixth head rank or anybody else, such as aristocrats who had been excluded from political power. And so we see the breakdown of the system in general and the breakdown of the Shilla dynasty. Once the bone rank system collapses, then there is an opportunity now for upward social mobility. And because of the struggle for power amongst these local warlords and local strongmen, military power becomes extremely important. And as this restructuring is taking place, we also see a restructuring of the social system. So with the collapse of Shilla, We also see the rise of a new elite who are instrumental in forming in the next dynasty, which is the Koryo dynasty, established in 918. So we do see the rise of a new elite partially, but there are also some elements from the previous elite that remain. Another reason for the renewed emphasis on military power is because of the threat from the Khitans in the north. So the Khitans, because they had consolidated their tribes and were forming the Liao dynasty, this posed a threat to what was starting to form at the end of Shilla and the beginning of the Koryo dynasty. So we see a renewed emphasis on military strength, and this allows those with military power, like military officials or local strongmen, to exert their power. After the Koryo dynasty is established, we see a new social structure taking place. So because of the dissatisfaction with the previous bone rank system, where one was essentially stuck in the social class that they were born into, we see a restructuring of society. And during the Koryo dynasty, instead of a system based on one's birth, we see the formation of a social system based on one's political function and responsibility to the state. So there are these different social orders that emerge. There is a civil order, and these are made up of civil officials. There's a military order made up of military officials. There's a court functionary order made up of clerks for the court. There's a soldiering order for soldiers. There's a clerical order for local clerks. And then there are peasants, lowborn, and slaves. So we see that there are big differences with Shilla because one's status is not necessarily determined by one's birth, but determined by one's occupation or one's obligations to the state. Now, social status during the Koryo dynasty was hereditary in principle, but we do see quite a bit of upward movement, particularly amongst the local clerks and the soldiering orders. So, the local clerks, as they participated in the civil service examination system, if they successfully passed higher and higher exams, then this could lead them to promotion to the civil order and allow them to be civil officials. The soldiers, if they were able to perform great acts of bravery or some extraordinary act for the Koryo dynasty, then they would be able to move up into the military official order. So we do see quite an amount of upward social mobility during the Koryo dynasty. The importance of the civil service examination increases, particularly after the 11th century. So there were different types of civil service exams. There was the composition exam, there was the classics exam, there was a miscellaneous exam. Not all of these were considered equal. They definitely were not the same. So depending on which exam you passed, that would determine what kind of a government position you were given. If we look at the hyangni, or the local functionaries, these are local officials out in the countryside, and they start to increase their power and become an increasing source of competition for the civil officials. As they are able to pass the civil service exam, and compete with existing civil officials, this starts to increase the competition. But by the 1370s, towards the end of the Koryo dynasty, we see this system start to break down. And it's not just because of the increasing competition, but a combination of internal and external factors. For example, at some point in the early 13th century, the Mongols up in the north invaded Koryo. And the Mongol invasions lasted for a period of about 30 years, causing widespread destruction and devastation, and as you can imagine, was very disruptive to the social system. Now, we can't forget to talk about the peasants during the Koryo dynasty, because not only were they the foundation of society, but they also made up the bulk of the population. These included freeborn farmers. They farmed people's land and private lands, and they were responsible for paying the tribute tax and for corvée labor duty. Now, corvée labor is if, for example, the community needs a road repaired. Well, then the local peasants would be recruited and they would have to contribute to repairing the road. This is not a public works project that was funded by the central government, and the central government would then dispatch workers, but it was something that was handled on the local level. At the bottom of the social structure were slaves. Now, there are different kinds of slaves in the Koryo dynasty. There were government slaves. So these were slaves that worked for the court or worked for the government. You can imagine that with the royal family and with many officials, there were hundreds of tasks that needed to be performed. And so the slaves, they fulfilled a very important role in this. There were private slaves. These are slaves that were owned by private individuals. Slave status was inherited. So if your father or mother was a slave, then generally you inherited that slave status. And slaves were considered to be chattel, meaning that they could be bought and sold like property. But one interesting feature about slaves in Korea is that there were also out-resident slaves. And this meant that, let's say you're a very wealthy aristocrat with a lot of land, and maybe you own different pieces of land in different areas. Well, since you can't stay and farm each land or go back and forth to these remote areas, you might send your slaves out to a different region to farm that land for you. And so essentially they were like tenant farmers. Also at the bottom of the social class system were the outcasts. And these included butchers, wicker workers, entertainers, and any other despised people. And essentially, these were people that were considered to be unclean. By the end of the Koryo dynasty, the King Kongmin, and Shindon, they felt that there needed to be a massive restructuring of the government and of the society. So the Koryo dynasty was on the wane. It had become very weakened. And so they wanted to try to strengthen it and rehabilitate it in some way. So King Kongmin turned to Shindon, who was a monk, to implement very drastic social reforms. Unfortunately, this was not well received by the aristocracy, and Shindon was eventually killed.
These are the keywords for this class: social status, bone rank system, civil service examination.